The throne of distant suns had been grown rather than built, and Cade Mercer had spent 11 days trying to decide whether that fact unsettled him or filled him with wonder. The ship's corridors spiraled inward like the chambers of a nautilus shell, their walls composed of living crystal that pulsed with bioluminescent light and hummed at frequencies just beyond the range of human hearing. He could feel that hum in his teeth sometimes, late at night, when the diplomatic sessions had finally ended, and he lay awake in quarters that smelled of ozone and something like jasmine, wondering how a boy from a mining colony on Europa had ended up responsible for ensuring humanity's survival among the stars. The answer, he knew, was that everyone more qualified had either died in the war or refused the assignment. Ambassador to the Velorian Empire was not a position that attracted ambitious climbers. It attracted people who had nothing left to lose, or people too stubborn to recognize a doomed mission when it knocked on their door with crystalline fingers and a formal summons written in light. Mercer fell firmly into the second category. He walked now through the Grand Promenade, a sweeping corridor that curved upward on both sides until it met overhead in an arch of pale blue luminescence. Velorian courtiers drifted past him in robes that seemed woven from captured starlight, their long, elegant ears swept back like the prows of ancient sailing vessels, their skin ranging from deep indigo to soft lavender to the silver white of fresh snow. They regarded him with expressions carefully calibrated to convey polite disinterest, though he caught the occasional flicker of something sharper beneath the surface. Curiosity, perhaps, or contempt. After 11 days, he still could not reliably distinguish between the two. The morning session awaited him in the Chamber of Concordance, where 17 subcommittees would continue debating Clause 47 of the Preliminary Framework Agreement regarding mineral extraction rights in the Kepler Neutral Zone. Mercer had memorized Clause 47 so thoroughly that it appeared in his dreams, its subclauses chasing him through corridors of living crystal, while Velorian legal scholars shouted objections in harmonic frequencies that made his skull vibrate. He paused at a viewport that offered a sweeping view of the nebula through which they traveled, its gases swirling in ribbons of crimson and gold. Earth was somewhere beyond that cosmic canvas, impossibly distant, a pale blue dot that most of the beings aboard this vessel had never seen, and many believed should have remained undiscovered. The war had ended 2 years ago, but peace was a fragile thing, a soap bubble balanced on the tip of a blade, and Mercer carried the weight of it in his shoulders every moment of every endless day. "You are early, Ambassador Mercer." He turned to find Counselor Vithys approaching, her silver robes rustling against the crystalline floor. She was old by Velorian standards, which meant she had witnessed the rise and fall of human civilizations that Earth's historians considered ancient. Her ears, longer than most, bore the delicate scarring of some ceremonial tradition he had not yet learned to ask about. "I find that punctuality reduces the number of ways I can accidentally cause an interstellar incident," Mercer replied, offering the shallow bow that indicated respect between equals. He had practiced that bow for 3 days before departure, terrified of the 17 other variations that could communicate anything from romantic interest to mortal challenge. Vithys's lips twitched in what might have been amusement. "A wise philosophy, though I wonder if any amount of caution can truly account for the human talent for finding trouble in unexpected places. We prefer to call it creativity. I am certain you do." They walked together toward the chamber, and Mercer found himself grateful for the company. Vithys had been one of the few Velorian officials to treat him as something other than a curiosity or a threat during these long days of negotiation. She answered his questions about protocol without making him feel like a child asking why the sky was blue, and she had once, in a moment of apparent weakness, admitted that she also found the subcommittee structure unnecessarily baroque. The Chamber of Concordance opened before them like a flower of pale crystal, its tiered seating rising in concentric circles around a central dais, where the primary negotiators would soon take their positions. Velorian delegates already filled many of the seats, their whispered conversations creating a harmonic undertone that resonated through the room's carefully designed acoustics. Mercer took his assigned place in the human delegations section, which consisted of a single chair positioned precisely to emphasize his isolation without technically violating any protocols of respect. He had grown accustomed to that chair. Some nights he dreamed about it, its crystalline surface somehow both warm and cold against his back, its position a constant reminder that he spoke for 8 billion people who had never asked for his representation and would likely never learn his name. The imperial family entered through a portal that materialized in the chamber's northern wall, and the assembled delegates rose in a wave of rustling fabric and murmured honorifics. Emperor Valdris came first, ancient and silver-maned, his presence commanding attention without effort. Empress Sathiel followed, her beauty the cold beauty of glaciers, her eyes passing over Mercer without acknowledgement. Behind them walked the 3 princesses, arranged in order of succession, each a jewel in the imperial crown. Crown Princess Ethera commanded attention with every measured step, her indigo skin marked with patterns of bioluminescent ink that designated her as heir apparent. She would one day rule an empire that spanned 17 star systems, and every line of her posture declared her readiness for that burden. Second Princess Nymera walked half a step behind, her amber eyes calculating political advantage even now, her mind surely cataloging every delegate's expression for later analysis. And then there was Seelith. The youngest princess moved at the rear of the procession, her blue skin luminous as starlight, her golden hair arranged in a style that seemed designed to keep it from her face rather than to impress. She was beautiful in the way that all Velorians were beautiful, but there was something else in her bearing, something that caught Mercer's attention and held it. A certain quality of resignation, perhaps. The posture of someone who had long ago accepted her place at the end of every line. Her long ears, more delicate than her sister's, emerged from that golden hair like the petals of some exotic flower, and as she passed the human delegation's lonely chair, her gaze drifted toward Mercer with an expression he could not quite read. Curiosity, perhaps, or recognition of a fellow creature drowning in ceremony. The session began, and Clause 47 resumed its glacial journey toward resolution. Mercer listened and nodded, and offered his carefully prepared responses when called upon, but some part of his attention kept returning to the far end of the imperial dais, where Princess Seelith sat in perfect stillness, her luminous eyes fixed on nothing in particular, her expression the blank mask of someone who had memorized every ceiling tile in the chamber and found none of them interesting. 3 hours into the proceedings, during a particularly dense recitation of historical mining precedents that dated back to an era when humanity was still learning to forge bronze, Mercer caught her staring at the same spot on the wall that he had been using to anchor his consciousness against the tide of boredom. Their eyes met across the chamber, 2 people drowning in separate pools of the same endless ocean, and she offered him the smallest smile. It was the smile of a conspirator, the smile of someone who understood. Mercer looked away quickly, aware that such exchanges did not go unnoticed in a chamber full of beings trained from birth to observe and interpret. But something warm had kindled in his chest, some small flame of connection in a universe that had felt cold and impossibly vast since the day he boarded this crystalline vessel. He did not know it then, but that smile would change everything. The morning bells did not chime so much as resonate, their frequencies rippling through the crystalline structure of the ship like waves through still water. Mercer had grown accustomed to waking before them, his body stubbornly clinging to a circadian rhythm, calibrated for a sun that burned impossibly far away. But this morning something else pulled him from sleep. A wrongness in the air, a tension that hummed beneath the ship's usual frequencies like a discordant note in an otherwise perfect symphony. He was still reaching for his diplomatic jacket when the first guards thundered past his door. Velorian sentinels moved with a fluid grace that belied their size, their crystalline armor singing with barely contained energy fields, their weapons drawn and glowing with the soft blue light that indicated lethal readiness. Mercer pressed himself against his viewport and watched them pass, counting 12, then 20, then losing track as more poured through the corridor in patterns that suggested organized panic. Their voices carried through the walls in sharp bursts of their native tongue, and though his translator struggled to parse the rapid exchanges, certain words emerged with terrible clarity. Princesses. Missing. All three. The ship transformed around him in the space of heartbeats. Bulkheads descended from hidden recesses in the ceiling, their crystalline surfaces sealing off sections with the finality of tomb doors closing. Emergency lighting shifted the corridor's ambient glow from soft lavender to harsh crimson, and somewhere in the distance, an alarm began to pulse at a frequency that made Mercer's teeth ache and his stomach clench with primal unease. He tried his door and found it locked, not the polite lock of diplomatic privacy, but the hard lock of containment, of suspicion, of boundaries that could not be negotiated or charmed away. Ambassador Mercer. The voice came from a speaker he had not known existed, hidden somewhere in the crystalline walls. You are to remain in your quarters until further notice. Any attempt to leave will be interpreted as hostile action and met with appropriate response. What's happening? He directed the question at the ceiling, feeling foolish but seeing no better option. I have a right to know why I'm being confined. Silence answered him. The ship hummed its unknowable frequencies, and beyond his viewport, he watched another squad of sentinels race past with weapons raised and expressions grim beneath their helmets. The hours that followed taught Mercer new definitions of helplessness. He paced his quarters until the walls seemed to press inward, then sat on his bed and tried to meditate in the manner a therapist on Europa had taught him years ago, then gave up and returned to pacing. Through his viewport, he caught glimpses of the search unfolding, sentinels tearing through storage bays, maintenance drones scanning every surface for biological traces, officers conferring in tight clusters with expressions that grew darker as time passed without resolution. He tried to contact Earth. His communication terminal responded with static and a polite message, indicating that all external transmissions had been temporarily suspended for security purposes. He tried to access the ship's information network, and found himself locked out of everything except a soothing loop of ambient music, and a documentary about Velorian agricultural practices that he had already watched twice out of desperate boredom during his first week aboard. The worst part was the silence from the other delegates. In normal circumstances, the ship's corridors would have buzzed with the quiet industry of diplomatic business, aides carrying documents, translators conferring in hushed voices, minor officials jockeying for position in the endless dance of interstellar politics. Now there was nothing. The human delegation's wing had become an island of isolation, and Mercer was its sole inhabitant, marooned in a sea of crystalline hostility. He found himself replaying every interaction he had witnessed during the negotiations, searching for some clue he might have missed. Had the princesses seemed distressed? Had there been tension in the imperial family that his human perceptions had failed to register? He remembered Seelith's smile from the previous day, that small moment of conspiratorial connection, and felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. If something had happened to her, to any of them, the war would resume before the search parties finished their sweep, and humanity would burn for crimes it had not committed. The viewport offered him a view of a junction point where two corridors met, and he watched as familiar faces passed through its frame. Counselor Vithais moved with uncharacteristic urgency, her silver robes gathered in her hands to allow faster movement, her expression carved from stone. Behind her came other officials he had met across negotiating tables, and every one of them glanced toward the human wing with eyes that had abandoned diplomatic neutrality for something far more dangerous: suspicion, certainty. the cold calculation of beings preparing for justified retribution. Mercer understood then that he had become the convenient explanation. The lone human aboard a vessel of thousands, the representative of a species that had so recently been their enemy, the outsider who could bear the weight of blame without complicating internal Velorian politics. It did not matter that he had spent every moment since boarding this ship trying to build bridges rather than burn them. It did not matter that he had followed every protocol, respected every custom, bowed at precisely the correct angles and eaten foods that disagreed violently with his digestion rather than risk offense. He was human. The princesses were missing. The logic wrote itself in letters of fire across the bulkheads of history. A new sound reached him through the walls, raised voices, angry and desperate, speaking in tones that his translator rendered as accusations and denials. He pressed his ear against the cool crystal and caught fragments. Search expanding to all quarters. No exceptions. The Emperor's direct order. Prepare for forced entry if necessary. Forced entry. The words settled into his consciousness like stones into still water, their implications rippling outward in ever-widening circles of catastrophe. They would come for him eventually. They would tear apart his quarters searching for evidence that did not exist, and when they found nothing, they would decide that absence of evidence merely proved the sophistication of his concealment. He had perhaps an hour, he estimated. Perhaps less. Mercer sat down on his bed and tried to remember the faces of everyone he had loved, everyone who would mourn him when news of his execution reached Earth through whatever channels remained open after the peace collapsed. His mother, gone these 10 years. His sister, probably still running that hydroponics operation on Ganymede. The friends he had made and lost across a lifetime of service to causes larger than himself. He was still cataloging his regrets when the footsteps stopped outside his door. Not the hurried passage of sentinels on their way elsewhere, but the deliberate halt of beings who had reached their destination. He heard the whine of weapons charging, the click of armor settling into combat readiness, and beneath it all, the steady pulse of his own heart counting down the remaining moments of a life that had never quite turned out the way he had hoped. The door began to dissolve, its crystalline structure responding to override codes that superseded his guest privileges, and Mercer rose to meet whatever came next with what dignity he could muster. If humanity's future ended here, in this small room aboard an alien vessel, he would at least ensure that the final human in Velorian space faced his fate standing upright. The light that poured through the widening gap was harsh and crimson, and the shadows of armed sentinels stretched toward him like the fingers of judgment reaching for his throat. 12 hours earlier, Princess Sealith lay in the darkness of her quarters and counted the soft breaths of her sleeping sisters. Ethera's breathing was measured and precise, the rhythm of someone who even in sleep maintained perfect control. Nymera's carried a slight whistle that she would have been mortified to learn about, a small imperfection in an otherwise flawless presentation. Sealith had discovered that whistle when they were children, sharing a bed during a diplomatic voyage to the outer colonies, and she had kept the secret for nearly 40 years out of a sisterly loyalty that Nymera had never quite reciprocated. The ceiling above her bed displayed a projection of the nebula outside, its crimson and gold gases swirling in patterns that the ship's systems had determined would promote restful sleep. Sealith had memorized every swirl. She had traced the paths of every gas current with her eyes until they became as familiar as the corridors of her childhood home, and still sleep refused to come. Tomorrow would bring another day of standing behind her sisters at ceremonial tables, another day of being introduced as, and the youngest, Sealith, in tones that suggested an afterthought rather than an introduction. She would wear robes selected by attendants who consulted her sister's preferences, but never her own. She would eat foods arranged on her plate in patterns that signified her rank, which was to say her lack of meaningful rank, and she would smile at diplomats who looked through her toward beings of actual consequence. She was 112 years old, young by Velorian standards but old enough to have developed a comprehensive understanding of her own irrelevance. Her thoughts drifted, as they had increasingly in recent days, to the human ambassador. Mercer, his name was, though she had heard it spoken only in dismissive contexts by courtiers who considered his presence a necessary irritation, rather than a genuine diplomatic opportunity. He was small by Velorian standards, his ears rounded and strange, his skin an odd pinkish tone that shifted toward red when he experienced strong emotion. He dressed in fabrics that did not shimmer or respond to light, and he moved through the crystalline corridors with the careful attention of someone perpetually afraid of breaking something precious. But she had watched him during the negotiations, those endless sessions where she sat decoratively at the far end of tables and pretended interest in proceedings that would never require her input. She had seen him stifle a yawn during her father's speech on mineral rights, his face contorting through a series of increasingly desperate expressions as he fought to maintain diplomatic composure. She had caught him sneaking a piece of fruit into his sleeve during a banquet, his movements so comically furtive that she had nearly laughed aloud and scandalized the entire imperial delegation. He looked at her differently than others did. When their eyes met across crowded chambers, she saw no calculation, no assessment of her political value, no dismissal of her tertiary importance. She saw curiosity, recognition, the gaze of someone who had also spent long hours memorizing ceiling tiles and finding none of them interesting. The idea came to her slowly, building from a whisper to a roar over the span of several sleepless hours. It was foolish. It was reckless. It violated approximately 17 protocols of royal behavior and would scandalize her mother beyond any hope of reconciliation. She was going to do it anyway. Seelith rose from her bed with the practiced silence of someone who had spent decades learning to move undetected through imperial spaces. She crossed to Ethera's sleeping form and placed a gentle hand on her eldest sister's shoulder, applying precisely the pressure needed to wake without startling. Ethera's eyes opened instantly, alert and suspicious. "What is it? What's wrong?" "Nothing is wrong," Seelith whispered. "I need you to come with me." "Come with you where?" "Seelith, if this is another of your—" "Please." The word carried weight that surprised them both. "Just this once. I am asking you as your sister, not as a subordinate member of the succession. Please." Something shifted in Ethera's expression, some calculation that Seelith could not quite follow. Then, impossibly, the crown princess nodded and rose from her bed. Waking Nymeria proved more challenging. The second princess did not appreciate interruptions to her sleep schedule and made her displeasure known through a series of increasingly creative threats involving Seelith's future living arrangements and access to imperial resources. "If you do not tell me immediately where we are going," Nymeria hissed, "I will ensure that your quarters for the next decade overlook the waste processing facilities." "I am going to show you what humans do when they are bored," Seelith replied. "I thought you might want to know, given that understanding their culture could provide diplomatic advantages." It was a transparent manipulation, but Nymeria's eyes flickered with interest despite herself. "You have made contact with the human ambassador, without authorization. I have observed him. There is a difference that will evaporate the moment Mother learns of this excursion. Then we shall have to ensure she does not learn." Seelith met her sister's amber gaze without flinching. "Unless you intend to report me, in which case I will be forced to mention certain communications I have observed between yourself and the 7th Minister's youngest son." Nymeria's expression underwent a rapid series of transformations, settling finally on something that resembled grudging respect. "You have developed unexpected depths, little sister. I have developed unexpected boredom. Are you coming or not?" The three princesses moved through service corridors that Seelith had mapped during years of avoiding ceremonial functions, passages that the ship's architects had designed for maintenance drones and supply transport rather than royal traffic. Ethera complained quietly about the indignity of crawling through access tubes in her sleeping garments. Nymeria fretted about her hair, which had not been prepared for public presentation. Seelith ignored them both and led the way through the crystalline maze with the confidence of long practice. They emerged in a corridor near the human delegation's quarters, and Seelith paused to ensure no sentinels patrolled nearby before approaching the ambassador's door. Her hand trembled slightly as she raised it to knock, the reality of what she was doing finally catching up with the impulse that had driven her here. "This is madness," Ethera whispered. "Complete and utter madness." "Yes," Seelith agreed, and knocked anyway. The door opened to reveal Ambassador Mercer in a state of considerable dishevelment. His hair stood at angles that seemed to defy the ship's artificial gravity. His eyes were bleary with interrupted sleep, and he wore what appeared to be a single garment that covered his body from neck to ankle in a fabric patterned with small images of earth animals that Seelith did not recognize. He stared at them. They stared at him. "Ambassador Mercer," Seelith said, her voice steadier than she felt, "I have a question that has been troubling me throughout these negotiations." He blinked several times, apparently attempting to determine whether he was dreaming. "Your Highness, Your Highnesses, should I be bowing? I feel like I should be bowing, but I am also wearing pajamas with cartoon penguins on them, so the protocol situation is somewhat unclear." "What do humans do?" Seelith continued, ignoring his confusion, "when everything around them is unbearably, crushingly dull?" Mercer's expression shifted from bewilderment through several intermediate states, before arriving at something that looked remarkably like understanding. He glanced at the corridor behind the princesses, confirming its emptiness, then stepped aside and gestured into his quarters. "I suppose you had better come in," he said. "Do any of you know how to play poker?" The cards were made of a flexible polymer that Mercer had brought from Earth for moments of solitary homesickness, their surfaces printed with designs that Seelith found endlessly fascinating. Kings and queens and jacks, their faces rendered in a flat artistic style that bore no resemblance to any royalty she had ever encountered, wearing crowns that seemed almost comically simple compared to the crystalline headpieces of Velorian ceremony. "So the objective," Nymeria said slowly, arranging her cards with the intensity she usually reserved for trade negotiations, "is to deceive your opponents about the value of your hand while simultaneously attempting to discern the truth of theirs." "That's the spirit," Mercer confirmed. He sat cross-legged on the floor across from the three princesses, his penguin-patterned sleepwear somehow having transitioned from embarrassing to endearing over the course of the past several hours. "Poker is essentially formalized lying with mathematical consequences." "I find this deeply troubling," Ethera announced, though she had not stopped playing. "Velorian diplomatic tradition emphasizes transparency and honor in all negotiations." "And yet here you are," Seelith observed, "holding cards you have not shown us and wearing an expression designed to conceal your intentions. One might almost call it natural talent." Ethera's cheeks flushed a deeper shade of indigo, but she did not dispute the observation. The quarters had transformed over the hours of their secret gathering. Empty ration containers littered the floor around them, the remnants of Earth foods that Mercer had been hoarding against the monotony of Velorian cuisine. Seelith had discovered a particular fondness for something called chocolate, a substance that seemed to exist purely for the purpose of creating pleasure, and which Velorian nutritional science had somehow failed to invent despite millennia of advancement. Nymeria had developed an unexpected passion for salted nuts, while Ethera maintained that she was only eating the dried fruit for diplomatic research purposes. "I raise," Seelith declared, pushing forward a small pile of the ration bars they had agreed to use as currency. "2 chocolate equivalents. You cannot possibly have a hand worth that wager," Nymeria said. "Your ears twitched when you looked at your cards. They always twitch when you are pleased about something." Seelith felt heat rise to her face. "They do not. They absolutely do." When we were children and Mother asked who had released the ceremonial birds into the grand atrium, your ears practically vibrated with suppressed guilt. That was 60 years ago. Some tales are eternal. Mercer laughed, a warm sound that seemed to fill the small space with something Seelith could not quite name. She had heard Velorian laughter before, of course, the polite titters of courtiers, the measured chuckles of diplomats responding to appropriate humor, but this was different. This was unguarded, spontaneous, the sound of genuine delight rather than social performance. "I call," he said, matching her wager, "and I would like the record to show that I have learned more about Velorian royal dynamics in this card game than in 11 days of formal negotiation." "You have learned that my sisters are insufferable," Seelith replied. "This is not diplomatic intelligence. This is universal knowledge." "We are sitting right here," Ethera pointed out. "Yes, insufferably." The banter continued as the game progressed, and Seelith found herself relaxing in ways she had not experienced since childhood. There was no protocol here, no hierarchy of succession to navigate, no careful arrangement of words and expressions to maintain appropriate royal dignity. There was only the cards and the chocolate and the company of people who had, for reasons none of them fully understood, decided to treat this small room as a space outside the normal rules of the universe. She caught Mercer watching her once, his strange rounded ears tilted slightly as he listened to her explain why Velorian royalty never gambled in public. His expression held something she could not quite read, curiosity, certainly, but also something warmer, something that made her hearts beat in rhythms that did not quite synchronize. "The prohibition stems from an incident 3,000 years ago," she said, "when the Emperor Valdris III lost the mineral rights to an entire moon in a game of chance with the merchant consortium. The scandal nearly collapsed the dynasty. And yet here you are," Mercer said, echoing her earlier words, "holding cards and wagering chocolate bars. One might almost call it rebellion." "One might almost call it survival," Seelith replied, and was surprised to find that she meant it. Nymeria won the hand with a combination of cards that she claimed to have calculated probabilistically, but which Seelith suspected involved a degree of luck that her sister would never admit to. Ethera demanded a rematch and produced a small fortune in ration bars from somewhere in her sleeping robes, apparently having been hoarding supplies against exactly this circumstance. The game continued. None of them noticed the passage of time. None of them heard the distant alarm that began to pulse through the ship's corridors as morning arrived, and attendants discovered empty beds in the Imperial quarters. None of them realized that armed sentinels were even now mobilizing throughout the vessel, that accusations were being leveled and weapons charged, and the fragile peace between their civilizations beginning to crack under the weight of unexplained absence. Seelith was teaching Mercer a Velorian bluffing technique, her hand resting briefly on his as she adjusted his grip on the cards, when the first footsteps sounded in the corridor outside. They were not the casual footsteps of passing crew or the measured tread of diplomatic aides. They were the synchronized march of soldiers moving with purpose, their crystalline armor singing with the harmonic frequencies of combat readiness. Mercer's expression shifted instantly from relaxed to alert, his body tensing in ways that spoke of training Seelith had not known he possessed. "Were you expecting company?" "We were not expecting to be here this long," Ethera replied, her voice carrying the first edge of genuine concern Seelith had heard from her all night. "What time is it?" Mercer glanced at a device on his wrist. "Nearly midday by the ship's cycle." "Midday?" Nymeria's face drained of color. "We have been gone for, they will have noticed by now. They will have." The footsteps stopped outside the door. Seelith rose slowly to her feet, her mind racing through scenarios and finding none of them acceptable. She could hear voices now, harsh and demanding, speaking in the clipped tones of military communication. Commander Torvith's voice rose above the others, issuing orders that included phrases like breach protocol and prepare for hostile engagement. They think you have taken us, she said to Mercer, the realization settling into her stomach like a cold stone. They think this is kidnapping, abduction, an act of war. Mercer had risen as well, his ridiculous penguin sleepwear somehow failing to diminish the gravity of his expression. That would explain why they seemed upset during my confinement. Your confinement. I have been locked in these quarters for several hours. They were not accepting visitors. He managed a smile that did not reach his eyes. I had been composing my final words to humanity when you knocked on my door, actually. You have excellent timing. The door began to dissolve, override codes cutting through its crystalline structure with a sound like breaking ice. Through the widening gap, Seelith could see the harsh crimson of emergency lighting and the shadows of armed sentinels taking position with weapons raised. Allow me to handle this, she said, moving toward the door with a grace that surprised even herself. You have given us a night of freedom. The least I can do is ensure it does not end in your execution. I would appreciate that, Mercer replied. I have grown rather attached to not being executed. The door dissolved completely, and Commander Torvith surged through with a weapon aimed directly at Mercer's chest, his face contorted with righteous fury and absolute certainty. And Princess Seelith, third-born daughter of the Velorian Empire, youngest and most overlooked of the imperial children, stepped into the line of fire and spoke with a voice that carried the full weight of royal authority she had never before claimed. Commander Torvith's weapon hummed with lethal potential, its crystalline barrel glowing the deep blue of imminent discharge. Behind him, a dozen sentinels held formation, their armor singing harmonics of combat readiness, their faces carved from stone beneath their helmets. The moment stretched like spun glass, fragile and sharp-edged, carrying the weight of two civilizations in its trembling balance. "Step aside, Your Highness," Torvith commanded, his voice tight with barely contained fury. "This human has committed an act of war against the Empire. He will answer for his crimes." "He has committed no crime," Seelith replied, and her voice surprised her with its steadiness. She had spent a lifetime speaking softly, deferring to louder voices, accepting her place at the end of every line. Now she stood in the path of weapons that could vaporize her where she stood, and she found that fear had transformed into something else entirely, something that felt remarkably like purpose. We came to his quarters of our own volition. We were not taken. We were not held. We were playing cards and eating chocolate, and if that constitutes an act of war, then I suggest our legal definitions require significant revision. Torvith's weapon did not waver. You expect me to believe that 3 princesses of the imperial blood simply wandered into a human's quarters for recreational purposes. I expect you to believe the truth, Commander, regardless of how inconvenient it may be for your assumptions. Ethera moved to stand beside Seelith, her posture shifting into the commanding presence that had been trained into her since birth. My sister speaks accurately. We chose to be here. Any suggestion otherwise is not only false but insulting to our autonomy as members of the imperial family. The Crown Princess herself confirms it, Nymeria added, taking position on Seelith's other side. Unless you intend to accuse all 3 of us of collaborating with a human agent, I suggest you lower your weapons before this situation becomes significantly more complicated for your career. The moment hung suspended in crystalline air. Torvith's eyes moved from princess to princess, searching for some crack in their unified front, some indication that they spoke under duress. He found none. Slowly, reluctantly, his weapon lowered, and behind him the sentinels followed suit with expressions of profound confusion. "This will require explanation," Torvith said finally. "The Emperor himself ordered this search. The entire ship has been in crisis for hours." "Then I suggest we provide that explanation," Seelith replied, "before any further diplomatic damage occurs." The hours that followed became a blur of debriefings and explanations, and carefully managed damage control. Emperor Valdris listened to his daughter's account with an expression that cycled through fury, bewilderment, and something that might have been reluctant amusement in approximately equal measure. Empress Sathiel's face remained carved from ice throughout, though Seelith caught her mother studying her with an intensity that suggested reassessment rather than simple disapproval. Mercer was cleared of all suspicion, though he spent most of the proceedings looking vaguely shell-shocked, as though he had not quite processed the fact that he was still alive to feel confused about it. When the formal inquiries concluded and the diplomatic delegations dispersed to process what had occurred, he caught Seelith's eye across the chamber and offered a small smile that carried more meaning than any words could have conveyed. The negotiations resumed the following day, but something fundamental had shifted in their character. Princess Seelith now sat at the main table rather than its distant end, her voice heard in chambers where it had previously been silent. When she spoke about human customs, about the value of games that taught strategic thinking and social bonding, the other delegates listened with attention that would have been unthinkable before her night of rebellion. "You have created quite the situation," Counselor Vithais observed during a recess, her silver robes rustling as she approached Seelith with something that looked remarkably like approval. "The youngest princess, teaching the court about human culture. There are those who find this development unexpected." "Unexpected is perhaps the kindest word for it," Seelith replied. "I have heard several others used in my presence, most of which I shall pretend not to have noticed. Wisdom and selective deafness often travel together." Vithais paused, her ancient eyes studying Seelith with renewed interest. "The human ambassador has requested permission to present a formal gift to you, something about teaching materials for card games. It caused quite the flutter among the protocol officers." Seelith felt warmth rise to her face despite her best efforts at composure. "I am certain it is purely a gesture of diplomatic appreciation." "I am certain you are correct," Vithais agreed, in tones that suggested she was certain of nothing of the sort. The gift arrived that evening, a complete set of playing cards, accompanied by a handwritten note explaining the rules of 17 different games humanity had developed over its brief history. Seelith read the note 3 times, tracing the unfamiliar curves of human script, before tucking it carefully among her most treasured possessions. 3 days later, when the formal sessions had concluded and the treaty signing loomed on the following morning's schedule, she found herself walking toward the observation deck without any clear intention, drawn by some gravity she could not name. The ship traveled through a region of space where stars clustered thick as scattered diamonds, their light painting the crystalline walls in silver and gold. And when she emerged onto the viewing platform, she found she was not alone. Mercer stood at the transparent barrier, his silhouette outlined against infinite possibility, his hands clasped behind his back in a posture that spoke of deep contemplation. He turned at the sound of her approach, and his smile held none of the careful diplomacy she had grown accustomed to seeing in his public expressions. "I was hoping you might come," he said simply. "I was not certain I would," she admitted. "This is not proper. Very little about the past several days has been proper. I am beginning to suspect that propriety is overrated." She moved to stand beside him at the barrier, close enough that the fabric of their garments nearly touched. Outside, the stars blurred past in silence, each one a sun with worlds that neither of them would ever see, distances measured in lifetimes and impossibilities. "The treaty signs tomorrow," Seelith said quietly. "The delegations will return to their respective territories. You will go back to Earth." "Yes, it is very far away, Earth." "It is." Mercer was silent for a moment, his gaze fixed on the streaming stars. "Though I have been thinking about how strange distance is. A week ago, the space between our peoples felt insurmountable. Now, standing here with you, the entire galaxy feels smaller than it did before. As though understanding someone, truly understanding them, changes the mathematics of separation somehow." Seelith turned to look at him, This strange, soft creature who had taught her to play games of deception and honesty intertwined, who had looked at her like she was worth seeing when everyone else had looked through her. "What are you saying, Ambassador Mercer?" "Cade," he corrected gently. "When we are alone, I would very much like it if you called me Cade." Cade. The name felt foreign on her tongue, shaped by sounds that Velorian language rarely employed. "What are you saying, Cade?" He was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried weight beyond its softness. "I am saying that treaties can be renegotiated, that diplomatic positions sometimes require extended postings, that the distance between stars is only insurmountable if we decide it is." He turned to face her fully, and in his strange, rounded features, she saw something that transcended the boundaries of species or culture. "I am saying that I would very much like to learn more card games with you, if you would be willing to teach me." Seelith felt something shift in her chest, some alignment of pieces that had never quite fit before. She thought of her sisters, who had stood beside her when weapons were raised. She thought of her parents, who had looked at her with new eyes since her small rebellion. She thought of all the years she had spent memorizing ceiling tiles and accepting her own irrelevance, and she thought of how a single night of honest connection had changed everything. "I would be willing," she said, and when she moved closer, her shoulder brushing against his, the vast distance between their worlds suddenly felt like nothing at all. They stood together in silence, watching stars blur past in ribbons of ancient light, and neither of them spoke of the future aloud. They did not need to. Some truths exist beyond words, in the space between heartbeats, in the warmth of shoulders almost touching, in the quiet certainty that some distances exist only to be crossed.